Part 3 of Chapter 9, we're going to cover something called Say's Law, which is a funny idea because it's not really a law. In fact, it's probably not even correct. And it's named after some economist, classical economist way back in the 1700s named Say. Last name was Say. So Say's law, if we wanted to put it in very simple terms, means that supply creates its own demand. And boy, I've gotten a lot of students who have not understood this correctly, to the point where when I teach this, the first thing I like to do is show the wrong answer, show what this doesn't mean. A lot of people think this means that if I produce something, someone will buy it. If I produce something, someone will buy it. And that is wrong. That is very, very wrong. So I'm going to cross this out, and I hope that none of you put that on your answers on the exam, because it is 100% incorrect. Instead, what Say's law suggests, all right, and I think that this short definition that you're going to see in the book and see online really doesn't do a very good job of explaining it, so you need to really understand it to be able to explain it. The basic logic here is that people work in order to consume. The reason why I work is in order to have consumption. It may not be consumption today, it may be consumption down the road, but the reason I work ultimately is so that I can consume things. And if everything was provided to me and I didn't have to work, I'd probably work very little, or not work so much in the traditional sense, right? I wouldn't be so much trying to chase dollars and trying to make as much as possible. So people work in order to consume. So if I earn, say, $100 working, that $100 will directly create $100 in spending. So the production, this production here, right? That $100 of working is production. I've produced $100 worth of value for my firm. Creates $100 worth of consumption. So every dollar that people earn in their incomes creates the same amount of demand. So supply creates demand. All right, so let's take a quick step back here. Supply creates its own demand is the simple way that you'll often see Say's law defined. But that does not mean that if I produce something, someone will buy it. It doesn't mean that production creates consumption for those goods. It doesn't mean that at all. If I produce something and it's valueless, I won't be able to sell it. It'll generate no dollars in production, okay? And it also won't generate any extra consumption. But people work in order to consume. So if I produce $100 worth of goods and services through my efforts, that will create exactly $100 worth of spending. And the end result here, or what we can take away, this is according to the classical economists, is that because production creates consumption, production is the key element of a successful macroeconomy. And so the classical economists, see, they're going to focus on production. They're not going to worry about consumption because they believe that consumption was a result of production. There's no reason to worry about demand. Demand will take care of itself as long as the production is there. As long as people are earning money, they're going to spend that money. Okay. So that's the basic idea behind it, and the premise of this is based on one of those key assumptions that we discussed before. So what we're going to do now is we're going to investigate the validity of Say's law. And we're going to do this through a couple of different examples. So let's say, for example, that I earn $10,000. Let's say I find I'm a contractor and I get hired $10,000 to do a project, and all of that's income for me. Okay. So let's say I earn $10,000 and then I spend all of that money. Okay? Well, in that case, in that specific example, Say's law works perfectly. Okay? So Say's law unquestionably is accurate. And honestly, this is so important, what we're about to talk about. If it really did operate this way, then I think classical economics would be pretty much correct across the board, and classical economics would be all you'd learn in class, and maybe you wouldn't even take this class. Maybe the economy would end up looking very simple if this is the way things are. But in reality, we know that when people earn money, they're probably not going to spend all of it most of the time. People save, right? So what we need to think about instead is, what if people save some or all of their money? All right, so what if instead of spending, let's say I save all of it. So instead of spending $10,000, I save all of it. And let's think about what that would mean if I save all of that money. Well, if I save all this money, what's going to happen to that money that I saved? What market do I need to look into? Obviously, it's not a product market because I'm not spending the money. It's not the market for labor because I'm choosing to save or not save that money. That's not necessarily a labor issue. But where this is going to enter in is into the market for loanable funds, which we learned about in the last video. So here's the market for loanable funds. Okay, where this is the quantity of labor, the quantity of loanable funds, and that right there is the interest rate. And as we saw last class, the supply curve, what would typically be the supply curve, is still a supply curve, but it shows savings. And then the demand curve shows investment, or as I like to put it, the borrowers. Savers curve is upward sloping because the higher the interest rate, the more people want to save. Borrowers is downward sloping because the lower the interest rate, the more people want to borrow. So let's imagine this is our current scenario, where this is our interest rate at equilibrium, and this is our quantity of loanable funds also at equilibrium. Okay? What this would mean is that QE, the amount saved, is exactly equal to the amount borrowed. The amount saved is exactly equal to the amount borrowed. Okay? But let's think about what happens when I save that money. Okay, so here's our starting point. Let's imagine our economy is operating perfectly, and certainly this loanable funds market is. All the money saved is borrowed. Well, what's going to happen when I save $10,000 into this market? What is going to occur? Well, when that $10,000 comes in, it's going to enter the savings part of this graph. There's going to be an extra $10,000 saved. So it's kind of hard to draw this, or impossible to draw it perfectly. But let's imagine that the savings curve shifts right by exactly $10,000, right? This is the quantity of loanable funds. So this is going to shift right, parallel shift by exactly $10,000. So this distance between these two graphs is the $10,000, okay? And so what we're left with temporarily right at the moment that that money is saved is the market is going to look like this. Now, what does that look like to you? What does it look like when the price, or in this case, the interest rate, is above the equilibrium? Well, what that is going to cause is a scenario where the quantity saved is greater than the quantity borrowed. Okay? Seems like sort of an innocuous thing, but it certainly isn't. If the interest rates get stuck at this level here, if they don't adjust, then think about what happened to that money that I just saved. That money that I saved in the bank is going to stay in the bank because the amount saved is more than the amount borrowed. Okay? So if you recall, that old savers curve was there. $10,000 was the difference between these two curves. All right? And now that $10,000 has stayed in the bank. It's not being borrowed. It's not being loaned out. It's not being spent. So, if interest rates aren't flexible, new money saved in a bank will not be loaned out and spent. Remember that when we're talking about the banks here, it's like I put 10 grand into a savings account. And what's happened in this scenario is the banks, they've got the money, and they're saying, hey, we've got this money. Does anybody want to borrow it at 3% interest? And there's no one out there that wants to borrow it. So in this case, the money stays in the bank. If it's staying in the bank, no one's spending it, okay? So no one is spending it. Think about what that means in regards to Say's law, okay? And this is, I should relabel this, right? Example 2, the scenario where I save all of that $10,000. In this case, no one is spending it. So what happens is there ends up being more production. That production led to me getting 10 grand than consumption. So Say's law would fail without flexible interest rates. This is an incredibly important aspect. Sorry about my handwriting. When I start talking and writing, that's when I get myself in trouble. So this is an incredibly important aspect of classical economics, because if this fails, Say's law fails. And Say's law is really one of the crucial aspects of classical economics. Classical economists, they focus on production. And production pretty much is all they focus on, because they believe that production will create consumption. And that's true as long as interest rates are flexible. All right? And one of their assumptions was that it is flexible. In Chapter 10, Keynes is going to question this and say, well, what if they're not flexible? Can we think of reasons why they might not be? And if we find out that this occurs, well, then everything about classical economics is wrong, okay? This is so crucial to everything else that they believe in. So for classical economics to be true, Say's law needs to be true. For Say's law to be true, interest rates need to be flexible. The reason for that is when people save their money, it must all get borrowed out so that all of it gets spent. So flexible interest rates is a key aspect of classical economics.